Selamat sejahtera dan selamat sepupu. Something a little bit special and different today. I have with me today Dr. Azmil Tayeb, an associate professor at the University Science Malaysia, and he's here to discuss a very interesting, somewhat controversial topic with us today. Is PAS a threat to the Constitution and the monarchy? Dr. Azmil, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. Well, Dr. Azmil focuses on studying political Islam. You study like social movements and a range of other things. You have a PhD in political science from the Australian National University, and you have this very colorful CV that I see on your, USM page right there. But tell me, Prof, like just really briefly, I mean, what got you interested in this stuff?
I've always been interested in politics. What really got me started when I was doing my master's in Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US. That first got me started to think seriously about the topic. But back then, my focus was on Indonesia.
Mm.
So I didn't start as a Malaysianist, right? So as someone who
Oh.
studies Malaysia, because I thought, like it's such a cliche. You don't have to study in the country where you originally from, so
Mm.
because many people do that, because it's within their comfort zone, right? So I thought, why not study somewhere else, right? So Indonesia is fascinating to me. So I decided to focus on Indonesia. So political Islam in Indonesia. So that's what I wrote my master's thesis on back then. And then I spent a year living in Indonesia as a Fulbright fellow back then. So 2007, 2008. And then that got me, thinking, expanding, my interest because I was teaching English in an Islamic boarding school in semi-rural South Kalimantan back
Mm.
then. So in Borneo, observing culture in the school, the ideology of the teachers, and the kind of debates, discussions they have, and I can't help but to compare to Malaysia, right? Because as a
Mm.
Malaysian, in this setting, and then it's like, how, and so there's so much difference, between in Indonesia and Malaysia, right? I mean, the kind of openness that you see in Indonesia, I mean, this is a really conservative, Islamic, boarding school environment, right? But there's openness, people can debate, people can have differences of,
Mm.
ideology, but they're all acceptable, right? Which I
Mm.
don't think is possible in Malaysia. So I thought,
Wow.
this is an interesting topic to do for my PhD, and that's what I ultimately ended up on, so doing my PhD
Wow.
comparing the politics of Islamic education, the management of Islamic education in Indonesia and Malaysia. So,
Wow.
so that got me started in this whole journey that going back more than 20 years now.
Wow. And I
Yep.
think that that's a very fascinating intro point into our discussion. Really briefly, pass to most of you viewers of this channel. You are aware it's the Parti Islam Se-Malaysia. It's the largest political party in Malaysia in terms of parliamentary seats at the moment, 43 seats for all. It is essentially what we call an Islamist party, and it is essentially campaigning on that front right there and kind of going forward and, taking part in a whole range of different activities to, fight for this harakat, as it were. And it's kind of interesting to witness what it's been doing over this time right here, but I'm not the expert. You are, sir. And really rapid fire question. So, is PAS a threat to the Constitution and the monarchy? Professor Asmil, would you say yes or would you say no?
I'd say it's a bit more complicated than that. So,
Fair,
I
yep.
mean, it's a cop-out answer, I guess. But I think, like as in everything else in life, I mean, it's not, simple black and white. There are a lot of nuances, a lot of the shades of gray in
Mm.
between, right? So I think with PAS,
Mm.
um, as with other Islamist movements, Islamist organizations, transnational, I mean, inspired, by transnational Islamist movements,
Mm.
particularly the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, um, tends to have a complicated relationship with the state or the government,
Mm.
and also other figures of authorities in Malaysia. So when we go to Malaysia, you have the secular government, the the federal government, but you also have the religious authority and the Sultan, which is the head of Islamic affairs in his respective states, right?
Mm,
For most Islamist organizations, they tend to see themselves as, transcending ethnic differences, because
mm,
Muslim as an ummah, they see themselves as Muslim first, right?
mm,
Malay. So back to past. So the direction that the party takes exclusively depends on its leadership. So
mm,
if its leadership tends to be more cosmopolitan in a sense, more transnational, more outward oriented, perhaps like the late Nick Aziz,
mm,
so the long time chief minister of Kelantan who passed
mm,
away in 2005, in 2015.
mm.
um, then the party would move in a certain direction, in that direction,
I see. Mm,
um, taken by its leader.
wonderful.
Now you have Hadiah Wang, which is like almost the opposite of Nick Aziz, right?
Mm,
Hadi is more, he has a very strong Malay nationalist trait within him, right? And then he sees both, the Malay identity and Islamic identity are both equally strong, and then so now you have the, past like going more towards on the Malay national or Malay ultra nationalist, path, right?
mm.
Intertwined with this religious Islamic identity.
Wow.
So
Well,
not, in other words, more inward
I
looking
see.
orientation as opposed to more outward, looking at Islam is not just Malays, it encompasses other groups,
Mm,
right? This ummatic, the ummah, global mindset, So now I think it's more inward looking, more like the Malay is, reinforces this Islamic identity. Yeah. So so I think this is where we're seeing past is at right now.
wonderful. Thank you for that. Now, allow me to now go into why I would even ask this very controversial question. And it's nice that you mentioned that things are not totally black or white. I mean, there is this famous quote, in fact, from Deng Xiaoping, the ex-leader of China, who said that it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white. What matters is that it catches mice. And of course, well, catching mice in this context might be, well, running a successful society or anything that you have out there. But I want to draw in on this idea of like what we call Malay nationalism. I mean, in the constitution, we have this idea that Melayu dan Islam berpisah tiada. It's listed
Mhm,
in Article 160
mhm,
of the constitution right here. But and I'll tell you guys, the viewers out there, why I even heard of Dr. Azmil in the first place. I was listening to his excellent conversation with Sharaad Kuttan from BFM, which I'm going to be linking down below, about this idea really of past and the constitution. It all kind of started with this one post, right, from Hadi Awang, as you sort of mentioned right here, that really got me thinking and wondering along the way. So then, like, I'm just going to show it on the screen for all of you to see right about now, and I'll translate it along the way.
mhm,
So, Minda President PAS,
mhm,
ketinggian Islam wajib dipertahankan. So like the supremacy of Islam must be protected. We accept the constitution, the federal constitution that was created or crafted by colonizers who planned an independence that lied to the followers of Islam or the Ummah with the goal of not in any way giving power to Islam, even though our country was said to be independent and the colonizers had returned to their original countries. They left a heritage that still colonizes us via the constitution that was crafted by the Reed Commission without involving the lawmakers of our country in any way. And you have right here a range of different things that eventually set off this sequence of events that led to, well, a royal rebuke, so to speak, from the Sultan of Selangor, which is what I was, reading about before I heard what you had to
mhm,
say in the very first place. In the podcast, you talked about how, and this is something that I just completely did not know about, like how, in the Tafiz schools, for example,
mhm,
children don't have to sing Negaraku. They don't have to, well, recite Rukun Negara. It's basically a colonial thing. It's not something that they accept, kind of thing. And those are things, right, that to me just seem to be so ingrained in my concept of like a nation, of loyalty to my country, of being a Malaysian citizen, of being, someone just enmeshed in that very idea from birth, right? That I was a part of this land, I somehow was meant to have some ownership in that land, but here we have an almost parallel stream. I don't know, Prof. Like, what have your thoughts or reflections been on this?
I
I did
mean,
not know.
the excerpt that you mentioned, that you brought up, it's nothing new for Hadi Awang. I mean, he has been very consistent when it comes to this matter since the early 80s, right? So if you remember from back then, when he issued the highly controversial Amanat Hadi,
Mm-hmm,
basically harping on the same thing, right? So the construction is a colonial construct. We're still being colonized. We are colonial stooges, and we're not emancipated. We're still being colonized. I mean, we might be physically liberated, but psychologically we're still colonized. This is not us. This is what's been constructed for us by the colonizers. So basically the same thing that he brought up, right?
mm,
But this whole thing goes back to the idea that there's no higher authority than God, right? So,
mm,
and then to put the sultans and the federal government, the constitution above or the same level as God, as the authority of God, is blasphemous, is idolatry, tawhid, like the term, this Arabic term they use, right? Like when you worship, other powers than God, right?
mm,
So, and it's a major sin in Islam, right? So to them, the highest power in any country should be the word of God itself, right? So the Quran, the Sharia law, it's not the constitution, it's not your civil law, it's not the courts, it's not the government, it's not the prime minister, it's not the sultan,
mm,
but the Quran and the ulama, the people who are endowed with this authority to interpret the word of God.
mm,
So these are the authority, right?
mm,
So hence, this you have um, you know some Islamic schools. I mean, I wouldn't say all Islamic schools, but there are many Islamic schools, and not just past school, but other Islamist movements also. I mean, they share the same beliefs, right? Like the ultimate authority is God.
mm,
So anything that symbolizes this secular earthly powers,
mm,
should not be given the same level of respect, right?
mm,
So it means like these symbols like flag or national anthem, it's like they're equating, singing national anthem or flying the flag as idolatry in a way,
wow.
right? Tawhid, yeah. So that's why you see this in many schools, Islamist schools, right?
Mm,
So they don't wave the Jalur Gemilang,
mm,
or they don't sing the national anthem, right? So
mm.
because of this idea, right?
I see.
The Constitution. So for people like Hadi Awang, I mean, of course, you live in Malaysia, you have to accept, however grudgingly, that this is the highest law in land. But if it's up to him, of course, he wants to change the constitution,
I see.
or maybe even abolish the constitution and just refer to the to the
Whoa.
Quran. Uh, and also because
And
that's the ultimate authority, right? The word of God.
okay.
So, I mean, this is, of course, I mean, this is, pie in the sky. But this is what they mean by, say we want to make Malaysia an Islamic state, right? So,
Ooh.
so this is what they mean. It's not simply, I mean, it's not just forcing the Muslims to follow the precepts of the Sharia, but also non-Muslims, living, who happen to live in this Islamic state, right? And
Mm,
they use examples from the past, back then during the Prophet Muhammad time, because you have the
mm,
non-Muslims still living in Medina,
mm.
and they paying certain special
Jizya, that.
pledges. Yeah, yes, of course,
Mm,
that kind, like how they separate the
yeah,
kafir,
yeah.
one who are friendly to Muslims, and then the kafir who are at war against Muslim. Right? So this
Mm,
is what they have in mind, right? When they say like Malaysia an Islamic state.
Mhm.
And what they aspire to, right?
Yeah.
So,
And I mean, like, I think it's fascinating to sort of like understand that because I can imagine that, well, not everybody is sort of like aware that that is maybe like how they conceptualize the world or like how they think about the world. Having said that, I have a sort of like specific question. In your podcast with Mr. Kuttan, so then you were talking about how, like, in these schools, right? So, like, sure, they don't sing Negaraku, they don't read out the Rukun Negara. At the time when you talked about that idea, so you said that they can continue doing that sort of thing because they're not monitored by the Ministry of Education. Now, then here's the interesting question here. Like, if they were monitored, then by right, should it be the case that they change their policy? And I'll tell you why I asked that in the very first place. Now, you may have read Wa'il Halak's The Impossible State, this idea that essentially the Islamic state of which we speak, whereby perhaps, everything is lived in line with the divine revealed Sharia law, essentially, is impossible under the modern constraints of the state in like almost every single way that you could think about. So when we think about Malaysia, right? So then if let's suppose, right, that the education ministry wanted to, could it, for example, go into these kinds of schools, right, and say, hey, look, you're not inculcating patriotism, and this is something that they try to do, right? Like, we recall that maybe this definitely happened, but the education ministry was saying, look, like, we're going to introduce like these badges for you, like we're going to introduce like the jalur gemilang, like all of you will wear it, it's going to inculcate sort of patriotism right here, which suggests that, well, that's something that the education ministry has in mind, they want to do as a sort of policy objective. But then, yeah, like, if you have a whole class of schools, right, that are not really like complying with this like valuation of the flag kind of thing right there. If the education ministry were to sort of like choose to intervene, like, could they? What do you think?
I don't think they can because I mean they're not allowed to by the constitution, right? Because Islamic affairs, it falls under Schedule 9 in the Constitution, the prerogatives of the states, right? So when you look at the Schedule 9 list, so the powers that's endowed to the states, includes the Islamic affairs, Malay affairs, which is under the purview of the Sultan, and the religious authority, the state religious authority, Majlis Agama Islam Negeri. So these schools, especially schools that are not part of the national education system, right? The Tahfiz school and many of the schools, Pondok schools, they're not within the national education orbit. So hence they're not monitored by the Ministry of Education. So they're
Huh.
outside of the purview of Ministry of Education because they don't follow the national education system. So these are, purely religious education curriculum. If let's say, the students want to continue to tertiary education, then they would take SPM separately, right? So they would take classes like tuition or whatever, outside of the Tafi schools, enough so that they can sit for the SPM exam and then get the results so that they can continue on. But the schools themselves are just focusing on religious education curriculum. So they're not, so they're actually monitored by I mean, not so much monitored, but they're actually registered with the state religious authority, right?
Mhm.
So they registered, but not necessarily monitored. So they have quite a autonomy, so they can operate on their own, so they can fundraise on their own, very little oversight. So that's why you see a lot of cases sometimes, with Tafi schools, right? So I mean, not just like this sort of like sexual exploitation, abuse, or that kind of stuff, but also safety hazards. And I know like some years ago in Datuk Keramat, I think in Taman Sri
Mhm.
Keramat, when you have the Tahfiz school, like the students were burned inside, because they were
Oh my
locked
god.
locked in, right? So and then there's no fire escape. So this kind of be simply because there's just lack of oversight, like lack of monitoring, from the authority. right?
Wow.
You don't see like happen in like national schools because they get regular visits from the Ministry of Education officials, the state, education officials, so so because of I mean so but of course, like the other side of this is that many of the Stafi schools or this private Islamic schools, they're self-funded, and a lot of times they're not financially viable. So rather than closing down the school, they can actually apply to
Mm,
be absorbed into the national education system.
mm,
So they can be so hence then once they're absorbed by the Ministry of Education, they receive funding from Ministry of Education, then they're subjected to monitoring
I
um,
see.
by the Ministry of Education. So and all these regulations, requirements, and all those things. But usually requires a sacrifice on your part, so which means that the loss of autonomy,
Mm,
so, I mean, it's usually the last resort, so if they still want to keep the school open and receive funding from the federal government, from the Ministry of Education, then they have to give up their autonomy. So some schools do that, some schools don't. They rather close down than having to give up their autonomy. So this is what's happening in Malaysia, simply because the constitutional rights, right? So that does not allow the federal government to interfere
mm.
in private Islamic schools.
Wow. Thank you for that sharing. And I think that this is actually fascinating. I mean, like, I would never have known, if not for what you just told me, that the government literally cannot intervene. Like that's just crazy to me. Like it blows my mind, like completely. And yeah, in fact, like there's a publication that I was reading a while ago from like one of the institutions that you're affiliated with, the ICES, Yusof Ishak Institute. I mean, like I was just reading this a long time ago. I mean, like there is this publication right here by Muhammad Faisal Musa and Afra Alatas.
Mhm.
Yeah, so like Perak and Islamic education passes gateway to the West Coast. So like they were talking about why it is that PAS managed to claim so many seats in GE 15. And it was mentioning right here that the investment in Islamic education is a neglected factor. And I thought it was interesting to sort of like think about that question right here because, well, in Malay, there is this proverb that goes melentur bulu dia dari rebungnya, like start them early, like
Mhm.
begin from like, I don't know, kindergarten stage. I found this like to be sort of interesting. And here's where the surprise that I promised to you at the start of our conversation. I was talking to you about this a little bit earlier on. One of my audience members is actually, well, someone who went to an Islamic school many years ago. He's currently studying in a university somewhere in the south. I won't mention like specifically where, but here's what he said to me. And in fact, like this has to do with Penang as well. So like yeah, he's saying essentially I was in a primary school founded by founder of PAS, while the headmistress is basically the daughter of the founder. You can read more about his history, etc., etc. The important thing right here is that he's from Permatang Pau,
Oh. Mhm.
which is kind of interesting. I'll touch on this point a little bit more later. So he says that a lot of youths basically believe in PAS. He's basically the only one who didn't really. And his religious teacher was a state poll director. And you can see like the rest of the comment right here. I won't go too much into that. And he essentially was talking also about how, let me see right here, next image. Yeah. So I asked him actually about like this idea, right, of I don't know if you heard of the Zakir Naik exact words criterion. It's a debate tactic that Zakir Naik makes use of in his debates, debating with, for example, a Christian or otherwise. Like he might go up to the Christian and say, well, where exactly in the Bible did Jesus say, I am God, worship me? So then, in the absence of such a statement, then Zakir would say, well, therefore, we cannot conclude that Jesus is the Son of God, or something of that nature. But here's what he said, right? Um, well, I asked the question of like, did your teacher specifically say vote for pass or your bangsa will be destroyed? And this is what he replied right here. Now, the reason I show you this is that partly Perbatang Pau. Penang Lang, let's go. You may be aware, and actually, well, to those of you viewers out there who are not really aware, so Permatang Pau was the seat that was held actually by Nurul Izzah Anwar up until GE15 when she lost by surprise to Muhammad Fawaz Jan, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of interesting question right here. So you see from the IC's perspective that it says essentially, well, education was crucial in the Melentur Buluh Bia dari Rebonia. We saw from the message that there was a real experience of somebody actually experiencing that sort of treatment right here. To what extent? I can't say, declare or no. It's something that you're far more experienced with right here. But then also, I wonder, in the event that this element were not present, then could there have been an overturn of the election result in favor of Nurul Izzah Anwar, assuming that that factor had not been present? What do you think, Prof?
Okay, I think it's not as simple as that. I mean, of course, education is an important element of any Islamist organization, not just PAS, because they see education as, or tarbiyah, the Arabic word they use, is a way to indoctrinate their members or young people. I mean, as you say, from such a young age, and to enlist them in the movement, right? So PAS, I think another misconception is it's not just a political party. It's not just like UMNO or PKR or DAP.
Mm,
It's a movement,
mm,
right? So that's why for PAS, its ideology is so important, right? Because it's a movement. It's an ideologically driven movement. PAS is a political party. It's a means to an end, right? So it doesn't matter if they win or lose, as long as the movement is still there, it's still going,
mm,
right?
mm, mm,
So since then it's an ideologically driven movement, and education, plays an important role, right, in indoctrinating, its members. Education is part of it. So PAS has its network of school from kindergarten all the way up to high school, right? So you have the PASTI, right? So, the PAS kindergarten, that you can find the network of PASTI schools, kindergartens all across Malaysia. And then, of course, all the Tafiz schools, the Pondok schools, the Sekolah Agama Rakyat and all those things, so all this private Islamic school, right, that you can find. And many of them are affiliated with PAS. So, of course, I mean, this is an important means to indoctrinate young people in PAS's, Islamist ideology. But to make it as if like it is it's a single factor that influenced the way that the young Malay voters vote in G15, I think
mm,
it's overly simplistic,
mm,
because I think there are other factors as well, because the trend has been, the Malays, especially young Malays, like overwhelmingly voted for Perikatan Nasional, right,
mm,
in G15. And not necessarily because they agree ideologically with PAS. I think many of them don't even know that they're voting for PAS, right? Because outside of Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, PAS did not contest, under its own logo, right? So it uses
mm,
the PN logo. So people don't know. Like if people voted for PN in Selangor, in Perak, in Johor, in elsewhere, they don't know that if the candidate is actually PAS or Bersatu, right? So
wow.
they know they don't. But
Mm,
if you go to Kelantan, Terengganu, PN actually contested under PAS's logo because it's a
mm,
well-known, it's a well-recognized logo, right? The moon. So everyone knows. I mean, this is past country, right? So
mm,
Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, right? So,
mm,
but outside of that, like when people, so that's why I think that it comes as a surprise when PAS won 43 seats, because I think, especially it's non-traditional areas, right? Seats. Part of it is because people don't know that they voted for PAS. They just wanted to vote it
mm,
they just voted for an alternative to BN and PH,
mm,
right? So and then PN Perikatan Nasional is the only alternative. And I think it's also, the way that they campaign in
mm,
G. G15, right? So because I thought I was in Kelantan 1 week, like leading up to G15, right? So I spent the whole week in Kelantan, following campaigns. I went to all the ceramah all over Kelantan. Yeah.
Wow, that's
And
dedication.
yeah, so yeah, I was there, and then and before that, I was in Kedah, and then also in Penang. Spent a bit of time in Pematang Power as well. But the final week of the campaign period, the I was in Kelantan, talking to party workers like volunteers, go to all these
Mm,
but it's all past, right? So in Kelantan.
mm,
So, but like they're very consistent when it comes to their messaging, so the way that they differentiate themselves, with other parties, it's like, oh, we are the cleaners, we are the untainted, we don't have corruption cases like the other people like Zaid Hamidi, for example,
mm,
Wan Eng, or we're not morally corrupt like Anwar, we don't have two sodomy cases and all these things, right?
mm,
So they've been very, very consistent. And then you have disaffected Malay youth, like unhappy with the status quo, with the
mm,
establishment politics, looking for an alternative, and or PN rather, I mean, they're very, very effective in presenting themselves as a clear alternative to those who are, disillusioned with the status quo, with the
mm,
politics as usual, who don't see any difference between, BN and PH, right?
mm,
I think this is the same trend you see with other, populist movements around the world. In Europe,
mm,
US, many young people, voted for Trump, voted for far right parties in Europe. It's like a protest vote in a way. And PAS, or rather PN, has been quite effective in presenting themselves that way, and especially through TikTok, right? And I think the PAS was the first party that really exploited TikTok,
mm.
and
Oh,
then
yes.
yeah, and then which many young Malay, which has many young Malay users, right? So they first step
Mm,
into that, and then they really reap the benefit from it, So I think yes, I mean to a certain extent, I mean I know both of them well, Faisal and also Afra, yeah, I mean, I agree to a certain extent, yes. Of course, through the schools, indoctrination. But I think for many Malays, young Malays, I think it is a protest vote because many of them don't go
mm,
through the schools, right? The
mm,
past schools to subscribe to certain ideology. You have to go through
mm,
the process, right?
mm,
So, like for past, it has Usra, which is a study circle, that you have to attend, like every week or every 2 weeks,
mm,
where you study all this seminal work by all these, Islamist thinkers, back when, like to the Muslim Brotherhood, because Adi Awang's, work and all, and then you situate that within the contemporary political context, like how these are relevant to our movement, to our struggle, to establish an Islamic state in Malaysia. So you have to go through this, right? So it's not simply like you don't get indoctrinated overnight, and even
mm,
that if you attend Islamic school, not everyone gets indoctrinated as well, so not
mm,
everyone have similar level of receptiveness to this ideology. So I think
mm,
that's what I meant when it's not as simple, right? It's not
mm.
just because yeah, you have these schools and then the young people attended the school and then suddenly they
Right,
all pass.
right,
Yeah, I
right.
think there are a host of other factors as well. I mean, it's
Mm.
one of other factors, or many other factors.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I think that it's important, the point that you raised earlier, because like definitely all of these supporters are not a monolith, right? Like they have like different types of occupations, like different beliefs, like different ways of like sort of like approaching that question. But like now sort of like moving forward then. I mean, there's this concept actually. I think that it's sort of interesting to think about right here of what we call the age of majority in a society, or you could loosely call it the age at which you can essentially have what we call capacity. In most countries, for example, you cannot, well, get married, for example, until you reach a certain age. In most countries, you can't drive until you reach a certain age. Maybe that's like a slightly better example. And when we think about, like, say, voting, so now, like, one factor that was cited, right, for perhaps why it is that maybe people started to sway towards PN was that okay, so you lowered the voting age, like you assume that voters were going to be more liberal, more aware, more democratically intelligent right there, and hence they will vote in accordance with some sort of like value system that maybe like you in your putting the shall we say policy into place had thought that they were going to vote. And I think that Professor James Chin mentioned this idea right here as he was talking about how, oh, maybe you should be careful about what you wish for, essentially. But now, we see, of course, that like when we think about voting, right? So like there almost seems to be like a sort of tension here. On one hand, you have like the right, essentially, for a person to go ahead and choose their sort of leader. But at the same time, then there's that question of like, are these people responsibly, however you might choose to define that according to your value system, choose the leaders for the country. And when I think about like sort of like age or majority in this context, I'm not sure if I like completely can see it because well, I mean, you can be really, really old, but like you can still be subject to fake news, right?
Of course, of
You can be
course.
40, you can be 50, you can be 60. I mean, like, look at the uncles in like the WhatsApp groups. Like,
Exactly. Yeah, I was about to say, like, I mean, look at your WhatsApp group, the ones who keep sharing, all this,
oh, you see
fake
that too?
news and all these uncles, aunties, pakcik, makcik, so
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah,
so that really, t tears apart the whole age, argument because yeah, I mean, just because you're older doesn't mean you're
yeah.
wiser, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The age of social media.
Hmm.
Right? So, I
Right.
mean, you have a generation who are actually born and raised in social media with internet, and then you have this older generation, this analog generation, and now suddenly, learning how to use social media. Of course, I mean, who do you trust, to be more responsible with social media use? I would say, this young generation, right, who's like from the day they were born, like they already like they've been given an iPad or like
Mm.
parents these days, right? They give their to keep their children quiet, they give them an iPad to play with, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Before they even start talking, right? So like they already. I remember my nephew, right? So he was like 2 years old, or whatever. He couldn't barely even speak. He doesn't even know what those words mean, but he knows what button to push on an iPad, right?
Oh.
Amazing. I was like, wow, like he doesn't know how to read, but he knows which button to push. So you have this generation, right, who's like digitally literate, right? And then you have this older generation who's like suddenly now, like wow, like we have this thing and like, and then, I mean, I think, they're the ones who should be more responsible,
Mm.
in what they do. I mean, sometimes I have to also remind my parents,
Mm.
that you have to
Yeah, yeah,
clarify
yeah,
that
yeah.
you have to do this all the time, so
Mm.
you keep sharing whatever comes across
Mm.
your WhatsApp group, your news feed,
Mm.
so I
Mm.
think it just
Mm.
it's not, yeah, it's not right, I think to
Mm.
say that young people are not respond. That's why we shouldn't have lowered the age. I mean,
Mm.
I feel it's really tiring, hearing this. For me, it's a responsibility. I mean, there's an individual responsibility to
Mm.
this. So it doesn't matter what age you are. I mean, you can be
Mm.
young, but wise, beyond your age, right?
Oh, for sure.
And I've seen that
Definitely.
many times, many people, and of
Mm.
course, you have old people who still like,
Mm.
none the wiser. So you have those, and I feel like okay, like you 18 in Malaysia, right?
Mm.
You can get married. You can legally get married. You can have kids. You can become a police or you can join the military and die for your country, right? But
Mm.
you cannot vote. For me, it's like, and you cannot vote to have a stake in the decision making process. Like
Mm.
to determine the fate of the country. But of course, you can die for your country. The country would love for you to die, for you, but you cannot. But you
Mm.
don't have any say at all, right? In the
We
country.
will hope to avoid that situation in the first place, but
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. But I'm just saying, like giving this contextualize this thing,
Right,
right? So,
right. Mm.
so you're old enough to die for your country. You're old enough to get married, to have kids, but you're not old enough to
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 vote.
vote.
Mm.
So to me, it doesn't make sense at all. I mean, just on this alone, I feel like, that if you're able to do any of those things, then you should be able to vote, right?
Mm.
So, I mean, I mean, for me, like, I think the responsibility to raise a family or to die for your country is even bigger than the
Mm.
responsibility. as a
Mm,
voter, you know?
mm,
So,
yeah,
like
absolutely.
if you're entrusted with those responsibility, then
Mm,
why not entrust, with the responsibility as to vote, right? So
mm,
for me, that alone should be enough, to lower the voting age.
perfect. And this offers a perfect transition point into something I was discussing. I partly discussed it when I first spoke with Tun Dr. Mahathir on a previous iteration of this podcast a long time ago. We were talking about like technology and like the way, in fact, that reality is splintered up. And I actually learned about this from watching the International Legal Conference on Online Harms organized by YB Azalina Othman Said like about a year ago. I can't remember exactly when. But I recall that there was this Nobel Prize winner who was talking about how, like nowadays in our world, we have splintered realities, digital devices, essentially little phones like these, one for each person that curates for us an assortment of information, narratives, stories, different interspersing, slightly subtly shifted ideas or concepts of the world that are partly dependent and curated on like your wishes or ideas. So I tend to think of that more of like sort of like architectural thing, right? That relates to why it is that maybe we may make certain decisions affecting, well, both generations, the young and the old alike. I think of that as a sort of like new, systemic, and complete change to the way essentially that we sort of like understand the world. But now, this then brings me into this question, right, about the institution of royalty. So then, the question that motivated this entire podcast in the first place was: is past a threat to the constitution and the monarchy? And that's very important, right? Because again, you have like these ideas, right, of like, well, on one hand, you have the submission to God, which is essentially what Islam is, if we were to go by the original Arab characters.
Yeah.
How it's interpreted is a separate thing. But then you have also now the institution of royalty. So then, past wishes for what we call an Islamic state, and it wants, of course, the ulama class to be in power, interpreting, deciding upon like what should happen in this country. But at the same time, like we see that the royals are the heads of the religion in their respective
Mhm.
state. I have an interesting example to sort of like mention right here. And that relates actually to the TikToker Rayan Wong, this individual who basically made a TikTok video criticizing both Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and also the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, Sultan Ibrahim. So like it was basically because of like the YDPA and Anwar eating at an Asam Pedas restaurant. So then what happened there essentially was that people, like upon seeing that video, right, criticizing both of these esteemed individuals, they started coming in and then basically insulting the royalty, insulting our prime minister, which is not allowed essentially in Malaysia. And showed how these religious people can subvert authority. But like when we think really about this idea, right, of how, like we must essentially in all ways give the ulama class power, right? Does that really have a compatibility, right, with a Malaysia where at some point, right, you could still want the royalty to retain power? And the reason I ask this even is because the royalty is an institution that predates the framing of the constitution. Like we've had like this institution of royalty for like so many years, from the Sultanate of Malacca until the Sultanate of Johor. But well, I in turn think of history. When we look at like what we call Islamist parties, right? So like we may remember the examples of a few different nations whereby Islamist parties essentially came into power. Now, democratically is a separate question right here, but I present to you the following AI curated and therefore not so detailed examples as you may be able to give right here. Of Libya,
Mhm.
Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Situations whereby all of these different countries, in different ways, had revolutionary movements whereby Islamist parties essentially came into power, subverting the monarchy and eventually taking over, removing the monarchies. Past has not taken part in armed struggle, they have taken part in elections. And you can see that, like, at least they sort of like, well, in name, like respect the royalty. They do use the royalty like opportunistically at some points. Like for example, when they were somehow supporting like Najib, despite and of course like there are like certain factors like related to that. But also like during the Sheraton move as well, when it came to the shift of power for the nation. So the motivating question then is here. Professor Asmil, do you feel that there is a threat, maybe like to the monarchy, in some way, shape, or form from past, as you understand it, in modern context?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you look at the Islamist, like I said, Islamist movements worldwide, right? So not just past, but other other countries or even within Malaysia as well, other Islamist movements. They believe in Islamic Republic.
Mm,
So, which means that, getting rid of the monarchy, the feudal elements in the society.
mm,
They've always used the Iranian model, right?
mm,
So you see what's going on. I mean, after the Iranian Revolution,
mm,
1979, they got rid of the Shah of Iran, and then they established, this republic led by the ulamas, right? So the
mm,
Ayatollahs. So this is the model that they have, right? So I think so normatively speaking, in Malaysia, if PAS ever comes, like they aspire to this making Malaysia an Islamic Republic, with the ulama at the helm of the leadership, right? Iran also has election, right? But you can see the important levers of powers are actually in control of the Ayatollahs, right? So perhaps the same formula can be applied to Malaysia as well if PAS ever gets its way, right?
mm,
So, but of course, I mean, it's not as easy because, I mean, Iran can only achieve that through a revolution, a violent revolution, right?
mm.
So I hope that Malaysia doesn't have to go through that kind of,
Definitely not.
um, yeah. So, but I seriously doubt that's going to happen, So perhaps, a lot more compromises along the way, right?
Mm,
Um, like I said, that's the normative, right? That's the end goal, But of course, I don't think it's possible to get to that end goal in the Malaysian context, right? Especially Malaysia is much more heterogeneous compared to Iran.
mm,
We have a lot more non-Muslim population, non-Malays. It's so much more difficult,
mm.
to achieve, that in Malaysia compared to Iran.
Would you say that that would be true, even if demographics change and then eventually you have, like, for example, I don't know, like a 95% like, well, Muslim population, for example?
Yeah, I mean it could be, right? But I don't know. I don't even know if we're gonna, I mean, unless you feel like mass exodus of non-Malays out of Malaysia,
Mm,
right? And then of course, even right now, you see the Malays have a much higher birth rate than non-Malays, right?
mm,
So I mean that alone, but to have that kind of seismic, demographic shift, I mean that would take like generations, if at all, right? If that's going to happen at all, I think unless if you have like I say, mass exodus of non-Malays leaving Malaysia, and then Malaysia is only left with Malays, then probably you can have that kind of 95% or
mm,
of Malays. But even with Malays as well, not everyone subscribed to past.
mm,
I mean, even in Iran also, not everyone subscribed to the Islamic Revolution ideals, right?
mm,
So there are dissent.
mm,
So I think we will see the same thing as well in Malaysia. But yeah, there's always the threat, right? Like I said, because
mm,
past, looks at the monarchy, looks at the government as idolatry. So ideally, they will want to get rid of these institutions, right?
mm,
And so, because the only thing that matters is the authority of God through the ulama as the intermediary, right?
mm,
So, as the representative of of God on earth, right?
mm,
So I think yes, there's always a threat, but I think like I said, it's short of revolution. I
mm,
don't the threat can actually materialize. So it means that PAS has to make compromises. I mean, you can see, like when they came to power during the pandemic, right? So when Perikatan Nasional formed after Sheraton move until 2022, I mean, they actually, didn't. like actively pursue their Islamist agenda, right? I mean,
Mm.
perhaps okay, they get distracted by the pandemic, but at the same time, like you don't see them like immediately, like trying to put their Islamist agenda like on track, on fast track,
Mm.
because now they have the federal authority at the fingertips, so
They definitely didn't ban becoming henna.
yeah. Becoming an yeah, so I feel that they do realize that the only way they can achieve power in Malaysia is through democratic means,
Mm.
namely winning election. So and winning election, they simply cannot depend on the Malay votes, right? So I think PN already maxed out its Malay vote. I don't think it can keep because keep playing up the sentiment driven politics and because I think they already get as many Malay
As
votes.
much as they
And
possibly could.
yeah, so
Understood.
but it's still not enough to them to gain to win, right? To win the government. So they still need non-Malay, right?
So
Non-Malay.
now suddenly that's why Muhyiddin is like Malaysian first.
Yeah, they still need the non-Malay votes, right? To
Mm.
either to Gerakan, which is completely hopeless, uh, and
Sorry, Dominic.
more like Gelakan, so. So at this point, it is gerakan, it's no longer
as we
gerakan.
are doing now. Oh my
A
goodness.
token non-Malay component,
Understand.
they get the Sabah Sarawak parties, right, to come into an alliance with the Sabah and Sarawak party. So GPS and GRS. So it knows that they have to make compromises.
Mm.
So the kind of compromise that PAS made during the Nik Aziz time is to work with DAP, right?
Mm.
So starting from the Barisan Alternative in 1999 election,
Mm.
right, and 2004, and then Pakatan Rakyat after that. So these kind of the kind of compromises that has been known to make over the long years, So it's not like the party is rigid in that sense, So and
Mm.
then that yes, I think that normatively speaking, yes, I mean they can be a threat. Yes, I mean they can abolish. They would want to abolish the institutional monarchy. But I think pragmatically speaking, reality speaking, it's not going to happen.
Mm.
And then also the institutional monarchy in Malaysia is quite pliable. They can be easily exploited by whatever parties, right? So they sort of like you can see the Sheraton move, and
Yeah,
after Sheraton move, right? They're quite pliable. They can easily be manipulated. So perhaps for past, it's easier to engage in that kind of to manipulate the rather than completely abolish the institution itself.
right.
As for the constitution, yeah, I think, if they have it their way, yeah, I think they would want to, and then put Islam as the,
Like
yeah.
amend the constitution, that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
but I think if like I
Mm.
said, them having to work with non-Islamic party or secular parties, especially from Sabah Sarawak. So I think it's not a great move, it's not going to endear them to these parties, right?
I
So
understand.
the first thing we're going to do when we come to power is to abolish the constitution, right? I mean, and make Islam, of course, all these Christian, the Dayak parties and the
Yeah, it's not gonna work.
Azan, Dusun, Murut, and all these things. They're not going to be happy. It's like, why we want to go in bed with you? When the first thing you're going to do is just abolish us. Make us,
Mm.
a second-class citizen here. So, doesn't make any sense. So I don't think PAS would do that also. But it's a
Mm.
good rhetorics, right? It's a good way to fire up your base.
Mm.
Um, so something that because this is something that you need to say to your
Your
base.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, always like very bombastic,
Mm.
extreme thing. But of course, there's that. There's also the reality, especially the reality of governing. And also being in opposition is easy to say these things, right? I
Mm.
think like the Anwar and Pakatan Harapan, I mean, they're realizing it now, right? Because when you're in the opposition, it's easy for you to criticize, to say whatever it is, because there's no accountability. There's no need to be pragmatic. You're not faced with all these kind of
Mm.
challenges. That when now you see the power in actually governing, and then you realize that it's not as easy as it looks. So I think for past is also they can say whether they want to abolish this and that. They want to establish an Islamic state,
Mm.
but when they actually in power to do so, and they realize that no, it's actually not that easy,
Not
right?
that easy.
And probably not even is self-defeating even, so if
Mm.
they want to keep remaining in power, then I think they have to be pragmatic, they have to make compromises, so maybe they do it in some other ways, because they still have to do it in, to appease their base, right? Because
Mm.
there's an expectation, right, from their supporters, from their members and base, that okay, now you're in power, then you have to fulfill your promises, right? I mean, the same like the Pakatan Harapan supporters, right? Like many of them are so disappointed with PH because now you're in power, but now all these reforms that you promised, in your manifesto, now you're not doing any of those. So I think the same with PAS, right? So it's
Oh
about this,
yeah. It's
so
like,
you pass the Hudud law, you want to do this, RU 355 and all these things. So what are you doing? So all these people will be demanding to pass to,
oh yeah, for sure.
but you actually now you've been given this power, so now you have to do it, right?
Ah,
No longer
yeah.
talking. So at the same time, there's the pragmatism of having to work with non-Islamic secular parties. So
Mm.
it's a juggling act, like walking on a tightrope.
It's crazy, yeah.
So you have to like give a bit of red meat to your base, like to show that you're actually doing something, but at the same time not have to make compromises. If you win power by revolution, then you get to exterminate all your
Whoa, whoa,
you can start
whoa.
over from year zero, like Pol Pot did in Cambodia or something like that. Then or in Iran, right? So you can just you can just squash all your opposition, and then you can rule by yourself. Then fine, you can do whatever you want, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
but I don't think that's going to happen in Malaysia.
mm,
So since that's not happening, then these are the compromises that PAS has to make.
understand, yeah. And like thank you for that. Like that's awesome. Like there's that complexity as well, right? Like when PMX, for example, did the whole hari ini minyak turun, tapi I can't remember exactly what it was, but like kenapa tak jadi? Kerana saya tak jadi Perdana Menteri. Something like
Kalau
that, right?
hari ini menang, besok minyak turun.
Yeah, that
Something like
thing.
that, right?
But but
So,
but but see, the thing is, right? The thing that a lot of people they don't realize is that like he actually said something additional to that kind of like made it so that that promise was kind of like well, not really the promise that they thought, right? So then there's like this interesting question, right? Like, did you actually promise it, or did people think that you promised it? There's a difference, right? Like, if we actually like have the picture, like yeah, I made an actual transcription of this right here. It's yeah, Anwar himself actually like this picture. But like, see, the thing is, right, like it says dengan harga minyak sekarang, with today's price of oil, so like basically if the price of oil goes up, then like technically then he doesn't need to deliver on that sort of promise right here. But well, thank you so much so far for this sort of discussion, Prof. And now I want to ask you a devil's advocate question. Like, we can't rule out the possibility that at some point, then you could have a situation whereby past becomes like completely dominant, right? Like, through those legal political means, gain the ability to do what it wants, so to speak, in that way. Supposing that the royalty were to sort of like take action ex ante to sort of like mitigate the possibility, right, that eventually it should be prone to manipulation, or to essentially move past in the direction of being a, well, however you choose to define it, right? Like productive, beneficial force in Malaysia, right? What kinds of things do you feel that, well, the monarchy can do? And if not just the monarchy, because I'm sure that this is a whole society effort, what can civil society do in order to, well, help pass kind of like move on these sorts of guardrails?
I wouldn't place any hope on the monarchy to stem the rise of past, or the rise of this extreme conservatism in Malaysia, or especially in the Malay society. When you look at the history of the monarchy, they're not exactly like a role model for like an Islamic role model, right? So they've always been Anglophile.
Mm,
The reason that they've been made the head of Islamic and Malay affairs was actually given to them by the British.
mm,
It's not like something that's been there since time immemorial.
mm.
So it's like after the Panko Treaty in 1874, it's like a token, like the British would take over everything else, but then you give this kind of symbolic power to the monarchy so that they can save face, right? So they can still be in quote unquote in charge of the Malay and Islamic affairs in their states.
Mm.
So, but I think for the longest time, because you have the state religious authority, um, they kind of like they turn a blind eye on the as long on the monarchy, as long the monarchy gets to do whatever they want, but then also allow the I guess to indulge in the more like Western ways of life and things like that, right?
Mm.
But at the same time, allowing the giving carte blanche to the state religious authority, to do whatever they want, right?
Mm.
So to issue like extreme fatwas or to conduct, all kinds of like raids or I know all kinds of stuff, like
Mm.
moral policing and things like that. So I wouldn't bet on the monarchy to save us from the from past. But of course there's civil society,
Mm.
right?
Huh.
But the thing is, you have to remember, this
Mm.
Islamist movements, it's not what we're seeing now, it doesn't happen overnight.
Mm.
It has been set in motion for the past 40 years, right?
Mm.
It's the 80s. So they've been doing this, like slowly changing the society, from within and without, right? So they've been
Mm.
doing it for a long time. Like I say, like they're a movement. They're not simply in it to win elections,
Mm.
because the ultimate goal is to change the society, right? To make society more and more conducive to ultimately becoming
Mm.
an Islamic state, right?
Mm.
So that's the end
Mm.
goal. So they've been playing this long game, like slowly changing the society.
Mm.
The most obvious one you see like people like Malay women wearing tudung, right?
Mm.
So I don't know if you're old enough to remember in the 80s, even in the early 90s, many Malay women didn't wear tudung back
Mm.
then.
Mm.
Yeah, most of them have free hair. Right? I remember, I'm old enough to remember,
Mm.
I grew up in the 80s and, in the 90s. I can see, like in KL. But now, like if you don't wear tudung, you're in a
Mm.
small minority, right? Moment, and then kind of the society kind of looks down on you, like
Mm.
why not wearing tudung, So I mean that alone is already, that it's a huge accomplishment for the
Mm.
Islamist movement, right? To be able to change society in that respect, like forcing Malay women to cover
Mm.
their heads, right?
Mm.
So of course, I mean, this is just, part of this whole effort to remake the society, right?
Mm.
Make it into ultimately an Islamic state.
Mm.
So I think they have set this in motion for the past 40 years, right?
Mm.
So if you have a counter movement now, liberals,
Mm.
progressives, the left and all this,
Mm.
I mean, you have your work cut out for you, right? Because
You do, yeah.
because it's like
Mm.
you have to play catch up, basically,
You do, like for a very long time.
So because
Mm.
yeah, I mean they have a head start, like 40-year head start, right?
Mm.
So what we're seeing now is already like this work that started 40 years ago. Now they're reaping the benefits, So those young Malays who voted for PN, they think the way they think, I mean, this is not just simply because like they, like overnight or
Nope.
they start to think this way, like if you need to have an environment that help to shape that kind of thinking, right?
Thinking. Mm.
That kind of deeply conservative,
Mm.
this all the kind of moral policing and
Mm.
all kind, so if you grew up in that kind of environment, like
Mm.
it will shape you the way you think.
For sure. Yeah,
So now
absolutely.
you have like one or two generation that actually grew up in this kind of, environment, right?
Mm.
Islamicized, increasingly conservative.
Mm.
So if you want to, counter this movement, that of course we have to start, right? So, but you cannot think like, having in a short-term gain, like to have a short-term gain, like to, you have to think, the long game. So the way
Mm. For sure.
that
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
and then you have to start from the ground. You have to do the hard work, right? Because this is how they do it, right? So they do it from the very bottom level of the society, right? So
Mm.
talk about schools, family, family influence, friends,
Mm.
like when you read like Zaina Anwar, right? So the founder of Sisters in Islam, she wrote her master's thesis on how Islamists recruit on campus, right? On university campus.
Mm.
So she wrote this book back in the mid 80s, right? So this is like when, Islamists was still like really ramping up their mobilization.
Mm,
So they say like the recruitment is one-on-one. She gives an example, right? You can
mm,
use it first. So like one Islamist student, right?
mm,
Uh, Past member or whatever, like, whatever Islamist group,
mm,
and then they would befriend another student, but not necessarily trying to convert that student into the movement or recruit that student into the movement, right? Just like do other like typical friend activities, right? Go to the movies, go
mm.
do other activities,
There's
go
like, I
walk.
happen to believe in this type
Yeah,
thing. I
so
see.
gain the trust of that
Mm,
person, right?
mm,
So you invest time, your energy with this person, gaining this person's trust, just one-on-one. We're not talking about like in a group. And then finally, when that person like fully trusts you, then you say like, and then, hey, like I'm actually going to this religious study group. Would you
ooh,
like to join? I think it would be good. We both of us can go. Like, and then of course now you like this, like you fully trusted your friend, right? And then it's like, hey, I mean, what harm can
yeah,
it do? Like, because I mean, she's my friend, she's a good person, like I'm sure she's going to a good
it's
activity, so they go along. So that's how they
wow.
recruit, right?
Mm,
One-on-one, right?
mm,
So this is what I mean. To them, it's like you building a movement, and the
mm,
focus is on quality, not quantity, because it's an ideologically driven movement. So
mm,
the number one requirement, you need to have your members that fully subscribe to this ideology, right? So not
mm,
just like political party, anyone can come and go, right? Or
mm,
you can jump party, it doesn't matter, right?
mm,
But not for a movement.
mm.
It's almost like a cult in a way, right? So it's like you're in, and then it's so
I see what you
difficult,
mean.
because you're fully subscribed, right, to
Mm,
to this, to the group thing, and you're fully indoctrinated.
mm,
So this is what they're aiming for, right? So this is
mm,
how they build and sustain movement into the future. If there is a counter force, right?
mm,
To guardrail or to stop, this, then this is something that you have to do. Yeah, I think you have to emulate, the strategies they
it's
use.
like
But
a new
yeah,
level.
but
Mm,
like I said, like you have to spend the time, the energy. You have to start small. You have to go,
mm.
of course, go beyond the urban areas. You have to go to the Malay heartlands. You have to, maybe install a beachhead there, like someone there, then start mobilizing people one on one, like slowly build the movement.
Wow,
You
it's like, should we migrate now?
Yeah. So how many of this liberal, progressive, like willing to do this, right?
Yeah, that's
So I
a
mean, because we can have this podcast, we can have webinars, forums, and all these things, right? And most of the time we just talking to the choir, right?
mm,
Um, but the real work is actually to do, like how many people, like you want to spend
mm.
time in Kelantan, in Terengganu, in Kedah, like slowly mobilizing people.
Yep, it's not that easy.
It's not easy. So,
Not
but this
easy.
is what you need to do, if you want to counter these Islamists, who's been doing this for the past 40 years. So imagine like
Mm,
the kind of head start that you have, in this race, right? So you have like 100-meter race, and then you have
yeah.
like the Islamists is already like near the finish line, and you just like you're just starting at the starting line, right? So how do you want to play catch up here?
Yeah. So like, I don't know, like is it inevitable? And it seems almost silly to show you this, but like I do want to challenge you on like one small point though. So like you mentioned earlier that like okay, so like maybe the monarchy may not really like do very much like when it comes to this right here, but I mean I don't know, like I saw this a while ago, for example. Like there was, for example, a specific incident whereby a Muslim only laundry basically like that wanted to essentially go right ahead and create an exclusivist
Mhm.
Muslim laundry.
Yeah.
And what happened was that later on, the Sultan of Johor basically said that, you know what, like, I cannot accept this nonsense. This is Johor, which belongs to Bangsa Johor, and it belongs to all races and faiths. This is a progressive, modern, and moderate state. This is not a Taliban state, and as the head of Islam in Johor, I find this action to be totally unacceptable, as this is extremist in nature. I mean, it's true that you have movements, architecture and everything out there, but I mean, like, I saw in this like one specific instance that
Mhm.
you have like a member of the royalty come out and actually do something that
Mhm.
well helps to move us away from that and in a very significant way. I don't know, like but how would you interpret something like that?
I think, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are instances, the Sultan of Selangor came out supporting the Bon Odori festival, right?
Right
Uh,
on.
that came under fire from the other Islamists, are we celebrating, this festival, and especially Malays, and then of course yeah, I remember this incident, the Muslim only laundromat. Yeah, I think I mean the Sultans. Yeah, of course. I mean, for perhaps I'm being a tad bit cynical. They maybe just for populist, reason, saying that because it's a way to endear themselves to the people, right?
Mm,
But I feel this is just it's only scratching the surface, right? It doesn't really get deep into. I mean,
mm,
doesn't really threaten the conservative power structure, the state religious authority. It doesn't go far. It's only superficial, right? So, I mean, it's easy to come out and say like, oh, like I don't like this Muslim only laundromat. I don't, I support the Bon Odori festival because it brings people together. I mean, it's easy to say this kind of thing,
mm,
because it doesn't require you to spend any political capital, so but once you like really touch on the powers that be, the people in the state religious authority, people in Jakim, and this ulama, this conservative ulama, then when you really threaten their power, I don't think the sultan will get a free pass, right? Yeah.
mm.
So I think for this, they're like, yeah, they can go, and then people's like, yeah, fine, whatever, yeah, but it doesn't really threaten, the conservative power structure that you have at the state level and also
Understood.
at the Jakim level. So I feel like, yeah, okay, it's nice, the Sultan come out and say these things, but at the end of the day, it's just that, right? So
Mm,
the status quo remains intact. So nothing changes, so there'll be other issues as well, right? It doesn't take much, it doesn't take anything actually to come out and say these things for the Sultan, So I mean, I think yeah,
mm,
more respect if you actually spend political capital in saying that
mm,
or go at the looking at this structurally, institutionally, like this is actually the problem. The problem is not like people who want to have all Muslim only laundromat or who wants to ban Bon Odori festival, right? Or to ban, like greeting Merry Christmas or whatever, this kind of thing, like this perennial thing like that keeps coming every year, right? So, but it's actually the problem is actually deeper, right? The problem is actually structural, is institutional. These people who are actually at the core of this. Actually, that's the problem. That one that needs to be addressed. That needs to be reformed, right? So that these things won't come up again. But if you're just addressing you're just treating the symptom rather than the disease, right?
I see.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Asmil. I learned a lot. I'll definitely like think a lot more about that, but I really appreciate our conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and also for your sharing as well.
Yeah, it's a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.